All right, so thanks for coming. I'm just going to, for the sake of the recording, introduce myself. And I'm Jason Hale. I'm a professor at DePaul, and I've been here 23 years. I'm a professor of philosophy in the philosophy department. And I'm a little bit hoarse today, I don't know why. And my areas of specialization are in ethics and moral and political philosophy, and moral psychology. So what I wanted to talk to you about is something that's sort of very prevalent in our society today, which is the reparations movement, which is making a lot of headway in California, and I think it is going to be a big conversation. It is already a conversation starter, and it is going to be, I think, my prediction, if I can prognosticate here, is going to be something quite huge in as a campaign conversation, I think, in 2024, because it's making its way through various initiatives in Congress as we sit here. And then the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that are part and parcel of almost every campus in America and in almost all corporations, and in some cases big businesses. So I sort of wanted to give a little bit of a detailed presentation on 5 ways to understand, but more importantly to defeat, because I think we all have some understanding of what is entailed by the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I call it DIE, because I think it should be diversity, inclusion, and equity, because equity is really what they're after, which is equality of outcomes, of how to sort of unpack it and how to defeat it. So a little preamble before we get to it is to understand what are their incontrovertible, what are their axiomatic claims that they're working with, the advocates of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, what is it that they're assuming to be incontrovertible, to be unassailable truths? And the first thing that you have to understand about the advocates of this movement is that the USA is still an intrinsically racist and bigoted country, in which a group of people constitute or continue to spirit discriminatory practices against themselves because of their skin color. That would be whites, who enjoy something called white privilege. And I'll say a little bit about that. And so later on, because such individuals enjoy an unearned privilege, they have to be abolished. So we have this notion of abolish whiteness, which is widespread among campuses. You hear it in critical whiteness studies, and you hear it, for example, in even a company like Coca-Cola that has an abolish white movement, like be less white, which means be less punctual, be less certain, be more humble, and shut up and listen, right? That's part of the new manifesto or the mission statement of Coca-Cola. And the second unassailable truth or claim that the DIE agenda works with is that systemic racism still exists today, which means not that racism doesn't exist, because racism does exist in many, many forms in society. But when they say systemic racism, what they mean is that there are laws and systemic norms and mores that systematically exclude blacks from institutional life or from creating life plans of their own. The third axiom that they work with is that capitalism breeds inequality, and that capitalism is inherently racist. Right? So you hear this notion banding about called race capitalism. Right? Capitalism is initially an expression of whiteness, and capitalism is intrinsically racist. And the fourth unassailable axiom that they work with is that whiteness is a problem, or that whiteness is a sin, and that one expiates the sin of whiteness, and it's concomitant privileges by pledging allegiance to the panacea of DEI. So it's a form of wokeism, and I would say the core principle of wokeism is that all groups have the same distribution of potential, and any disparities are the result of discrimination by whites. That's the core principle of wokeism that they're working with. All right, so how do we defeat it? Well, the first manner of approach is to ask, what is the conceptual common denominator that ties diversity, inclusion, equity together? Like, there are three distinct concepts. Diversity is different from inclusion, and inclusion seems to be different from equity. But something ties them all together. So to defeat the DEI movement, I think we have to unmask their most fundamental agenda. What are the essential characteristics that the whole initiative, and here we come to the broadest abstraction, the widest goal, which is subsumed under the concrete goal of DEI. So the most abstract goal of the movement is to turn all of our institutions, whether it's the military, whether it's tertiary or higher education, big tech corporations, or churches, the family, into cultural revolution centers, right? Indoctrination cultural revolution centers. It's a form of wokeism built on the ideology that's built on the abolition of what is commonly termed whiteness. And whiteness is claimed to be an ideology, but if you ask people to define, like, this came up in my class last week, I said to my students, somehow it came up in the existentialism class, so I said, well, how do you define whiteness? If I asked you to define democracy or republicanism, like constitutional republicanism, you could define it. How are you defining whiteness? And they couldn't. And that's the issue, right? Nobody could really define it. But if you read the works of somebody like Frank Wilderson III, Calvin Warren, who's the author of Nihilism, Emancipation, or Willie James Jennings, whose book After Whiteness and Education in Belonging, you'll see that the white abolitionist movement rests on a euphemistic for abolishing white people from the earth, and that is the only possibility for black emancipation. So these are the sort of tropes that the DEI movement works with euphemistically. And the second fundamental goal that they have is to really change the political DNA of the country to establish a socialist republic by, among other things, I think, stealth moves to establish one of the biggest lies about the founding of America, and this is this, that America was founded on the principle of economic equality. So, it was not. America was founded on the principle of political equality and equality of rights. So, once we understand the fundamental principles that undergird DEI, that all of these different aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion have a common goals, we can begin to sort of unpack how to sort of defeat them. So I wanted to first deal with equity, which is equality of outcomes. And sort of equity is sort of like an egalitarian principle, right? It says that equality of opportunity is not enough. We have to legislate outcomes, and it rests on a false egalitarian principle. It's a metaphysical principle that says that we're all equal, but we're not all equal. We're not equal in intelligence. We're not equal in frugality. We're not equal in moral prudence. We're not equal. I'm not equal of I'm from Jamaica, my fellow countryman, Usain Bolt. I mean, I'm not equal of Venus and Serena Williams in athletic prowess, and I'm certainly not the smartest person in the world. I'm an admirer of Jordan Peterson. I think I think I'm pretty intelligent, but I think he's enormously much more intelligent and erudite than I am. And I'm willing to admit that in a spirit of humility. So we're not all equal. And also, outcomes are based on virtues that we possess, right? Values that we have that are translated in a tangible form. And how would you redistribute virtues? You can't. So I just want to read a little bit from an article that I published that sort of sums up somewhat nicely, I think, about why equity, I think, this doesn't work. So, like I said, equality means treating everyone the same regardless of ethnic or racial affiliation, but equity demands legislating equal results from unequal causes, and unequal rewards from unequal performance. That's what the equity movement wants. And it demands, so I think it's a nefarious idea, and those who uphold the principle are attempting to advocate that all persons are actually born with or acquire talents and capabilities of equal proportion, intelligence, strength, perseverance, temperance, tenacity, rational faculty, wisdom, and so on and so forth, sensibility, just a lot of dispositions that determine outcomes. And so equity advocates attempt to pass over on society the following. If talents and capabilities and dispositions were not equally allocated among the races and individuals, then it's the state now that has to come in and legislate or artificially ensure that equality of outcomes and results precede equality of opportunity. That is, they mandate equal results from unequal causes. And opportunities, I think, arise as human beings are free to pursue their values and exercise efforts on behalf of their lives. So equality of results is a form of magical thinking. And the interesting thing, or the interesting axiom or unquestioning point that they assume is that all disparities in income among racial groups are reducible to the residual effects of slavery. And that's just not the case, because when you look at the statistics, at least, that many economists provide, especially like Thomas Sowell, you find that Nigerians at some point in American history, I think it was like in the 1990s, for a period they were out-earning whites, and that Asians today, well, let's leave Asians alone since they're called adjacent whites, that horrific term, which is a non-concept. It's like the definition of conceptual inanity. But Nigerians at one point were out-earning whites. So if it really were the case that the residual effects of slavery and its systemic racism were both the causes of income disparity, then Nigerians who are blacks would also be caught in that kind of vortex. So that's something that they depend on, this idea that all disparities in income rely on residual racism without looking at other kind of phenomena that could explain it. They also assume that wealth, which is privately created, is a sort of national treasure trove, that wealth is something that can be distributed nationally, that wealth is not the private domain of the individual. So Yaron Brook, who is he's the president of the founder of the Ayn Rand Institute, wrote a book called Equality is Unfair. But to shore up the sort of untenability of the whole equity argument, let's take an example. If I plant 10 apples on an island and Jack plants 5, one could not say that I have grabbed a larger or bigger part of the island's apple, so to speak, apple pie, so to speak, because I have created more wealth than Jack and I have left him no worse off. It would be absurd to say that I've stolen 50% of the island's wealth. If Jack especially made a choice not to plant extra trees, having rather spent his time relaxing under a coconut tree, there's no reason why I should be penalized for the extra initiative I've taken in planting extra trees and benefiting from them. So when we say that equity results, among other things, on equal rewards from unequal performance, you can see where that example sort of fits into it. So the persistence, I think, of racism continues, but to causally link all disparities between blacks and whites tied to slavery or residual effects of slavery, such as Jim Crow, seems a little bit untenable. And there are just a couple more things I want to say about the equity problem. And it goes back to equality of opportunity. I think equality of opportunity sounds like a really good idea, but I want to push back on even equality of opportunity and prioritize freedom, and the right to exercise the pursuit of equality, freedom of equality, economic equality of rights. So the reason I'm even suspicious of equality of opportunity is this. It sounds like a beautiful thing to most people, right? And in an ideal utopia in which all persons were blessed with equal abilities and exercised the choices and judgments in a consistently rational and productive manner, one could imagine such an ideal being approximated. But let's ask ourselves, what is an opportunity? This is why I don't believe in equality of opportunity. An opportunity is a set of circumstances, right, that makes itself possible to do something and to achieve a goal. So equality of opportunity rests on the idea of trying to equalize initial chances of success. But how do you do that without trespassing on the rights of others? So like a single mom, right, who works 3 jobs to send her 2 children to private school, both of whom work very hard and graduate with honors, will have more increased opportunities to attend Ivy Leagues than the parent who sends his child to like a mediocre public school. Or the single mom who graduated from Wharton's Business School and Harvard Law School, respectively, will, I think, have more opportunities than a mother or a father or parent who's opted not to go to college, whose children opted not to go to college, or even trade school, but to occasionally apply for jobs for which they're not remotely qualified. Just like the mom who, after working tedious hours, reads to her child every night before she falls asleep and sort of engenders a passion for books in her young daughter, who later goes on to become a successful book editor in publishing, has through her efforts generated more opportunities for her child than a parent for whom reading before bedtime seems pointless. So are basketball NBA players who dominate the sport of basketball to be penalized because they have more opportunities for playing the sport than Asian men, right? So I think freedom of equality of rights is what ought to be prized in a free society, and the freedom to take advantage of opportunities as they avail themselves to us ought to be our goal. So freedom of opportunity is predicated on the notion that circumstances that are often the result of value-generated actions of others should be controlled by the state. And I think that this is a recipe for totalitarianism. So I think opportunities arise as human beings are left free to pursue their values and exercise efforts on behalf of their lives. And values result from attributes that persons possess but cannot be redistributed. So there's a zero-sum game here. Opportunities one creates lead to actions and avenues and venues for others to properly take advantage of and benefit from. But freedom, rather than abstract legislation mandating equal results, is what makes the possibility of equality impossible. I just want to repeat this last part. An opportunity is a set of circumstances that make it possible to do something. And equality of opportunity rests on the idea of trying to equalize chances of success. And how does one do that? How do you do that? A mom who reads to her child every single night, and then that child develops a passion for reading, versus a mom who says that's just a waste of time. That child who has more opportunities because of that passion for reading that translates into action, like good study habits that leads to higher grades, is going to have more opportunities than the other child whose parent didn't engender in him or her a passion for reading. So how do you see how even if you think about it hard enough, equality of opportunity is just as fallacious as equality of outcomes? So I think that's one way also of defeating the equity argument, and to press for freedom of equality of rights is the only thing that a free society can really, really argue for, not freedom of opportunity and not even freedom of outcomes. What we can argue for is something like you cannot legislate a society in which you place obstructions in the path of someone in the pursuit of their opportunities, right? All right. So getting now to diversity. So there's diversity, equity, and inclusion. I dealt with equity, and let's talk a little bit about diversity. So I think diversity is a very interesting concept in the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, because diversity is predicated on the view that implicit bias rests, or put it another way, implicit bias rules the sensibilities of those in positions of power, that immutable traits such as skin color and gender and sexual preferences are the defining characteristics of a person's fundamental core identity and the bases on which they are appraised. So a diversified student body based on these, or working body based on these immutable characteristics, are to be prized over a meritocratic standard that selects candidates based on merit. So you can imagine a scenario where, and I've been in scenarios where, well, I probably shouldn't say this on tape, so I'm not going to say it, but I have been in scenarios, doesn't necessarily commit to saying that I've been in, this scenario has taken place at DePaul, because I sit on many committees in other places, but I have been in scenarios where I have heard people say, we have too many like white men in this setting, so we have to go to the black pool or the transgender pool, right? So diversity is predicated on the view that there's implicit bias and that immutable characteristics like skin color or gender preferences or sexual orientation should supersede merit, right? But diversity is also meant to introduce the idea of marginalized voices that have been excluded from the domain of conversations. But it's kind of like a tricky situation because diversity here seems to include a particular kind of political voice, and it's usually a left-wing voice. So my litmus test is when somebody says that their environment is diversified, I always say, well, like how many conservative philosophers do you have in your sociology? How many committed conservatives do you have in your philosophy or your literature departments? And the answer is like none. So it's really an excuse to not intellectually diversify a setting, but to introduce left-wing Marxist perspectives into an organization. But I want to say something more. I want to say that one way of challenging the diversity agenda is to say that diversity in and of itself is not a value. And I want to just give reasons because I'm a philosopher, so I have to give reasons. So diversity in and of itself is not a value. So a room full of village idiots, all of whom want to elevate their sophomore high school opinions to the level of human knowledge, right? All that makes you is a statistician of gutter trivia. It does not say anything about the quality of diversity. So diversity, one has to ask, what is the nature, qualitatively speaking, of a diversified body? Just having diversity for the sake of diversity without affixing a qualitative qualifier to it leaves diversity sort of either as an empty, it's not an empty set because there are people there, but it leaves it sort of vacuous or trivialized, right? So if it is a racially or ethnically diversified body that is achieved at the expense of other racially or ethnic bodies, that's just reverse discrimination. In other words, that I know that there exists a diverse pool of candidates tells me nothing in and of itself about the merit or the qualitative status of the candidates. So diversity as a standalone value without qualitative qualifiers renders the concept completely vacuous. But the motives of the pushers of diversity are obvious. What they're after is power, to undermine the meritocratic standards as racist, right? Since if you go by a meritocratic status, you are going to have, as we've seen at Harvard, a disproportionate number of members of particular racial groups scoring higher on certain test scores, or if it's a completely meritocratic standard being admitted into certain schools. As we see, there are lawsuits issued by Asian Americans in this country out of Harvard because they're being excluded from Harvard for earning higher test scores than other racial groups who are admitted into Harvard at lower test scores. You know that you all know this, of course. Particularly in the name of diversity. So there you have where a meritocratic standard is being erased, and discrimination is being used as a criterion for admission. And here we have Ibram Kendi, who's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. Here we have his mantra being directly applied to the diversity clause, where he says the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. This is a quote from his book. And the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That's what he says. And you see that being applied here. So I think what you have to do is show the inexorable logic of where diversity leads to. And you'll see that it leads to discrimination of one set of high-achieving groups at the expense of another set of groups that are not as high-achieving, qualitatively speaking, in their performance. And you'll see where the diversity argument really goes forward. It's meant to show that a meritocratic approach, according to them, is intrinsically racist, precisely because the outcomes are disproportionately, from a racial standpoint, in favor of, let's say, non-blacks or non-Hispanics. And they generate all kinds of explanations, such as because the society is intrinsically racist, as opposed to other causal factors that could explain why minority groups are not achieving as well as whites or other, let's call them, this horrible word, white adjacent groups, right? There are other cultural issues that we could, and Thomas Sowell does a wonderful job of explaining this. He says when he goes into the library at Stanford at 11 o'clock at night, the library is packed with Asians. And he has these wonderful statistics of showing that Asian Americans spend 40% of their free time outside of the classroom studying. Whites spend about 24%, and blacks spend about 3%. So there you have it. It's initiative. A lot of it has to do with initiative and not anything to do with prohibition from entering the library to study. All right. As far as inclusion, in practice, this is the prioritization of, when we talk about inclusion, diversity, equity, initiative, persons talk about inclusion, they're talking about, in practice, this is the prioritization of marginalized voices in debates, in conversations, in framing narratives, and occupying spaces previously occupied by dominant groups, right? So we see this in the case of black spaces in dorms, the demand for separate spaces in libraries, separate spaces in in student centers, and now we have different graduation ceremonies. I'm giving an interview on Friday from someone from College Fix who wants me to sort of break down what I think is going on in the demand for separate graduation ceremonies at Harvard, at Brown, at various universities, where they have black graduation ceremonies and they have just regular graduation ceremonies. If you're black, you can graduate with your cohorts in the regular graduate ceremonies, but they have black only graduation ceremonies. I know they have something called lavender graduation ceremonies exclusive for gay people at some of these schools too. So that's what the inclusion part of diversity, equity, and inclusion involves including so-called. It's a form of identity politics, which involves including people who have been so-called previously disenfranchised and marginalized and been left on the periphery of society, to include their voices, their experiences in the conversation, to have it be more democratic. The problem with this, of course, is that it comes at the expense of silencing any kind of dissent, any kind of challenge to receive wisdom or a challenge to orthodoxy. And it's a scenario in which the following plays out. Non-white persons are held to have voices that, because they're marginalized, they hold a sense of infallibility that's affixed to them, because they're experiential. They're talking about their lived experiences, and they're talking about their feelings. So it's not knowledge based. It's all experiential, and it's very difficult to sort of like challenge someone's experience, because then you're seen as a racist or a homophobe or a transphobe, and you are expected, that is whites, I think, or anyone who could be deemed a white adjacent, is expected to be put in a teachable position, is made to listen and to be basically a supplicant to the person whose voice, whose previously excluded voice, marginalized voice, now holds center stage. So you see this in some. I've attended one or two diversity, equity, and inclusion training programs in corporations, and it's really interesting. So one of them that I attended, I had to burst out laughing, excuse myself. So they have these professional actors, and these employees have to sit and watch. So one of the actors is a black guy and a white guy, and a black guy and a black woman and a black guy, and they're in the kitchen. And no, it's an interracial couple. I'm sorry, it's a white guy and a black woman, and they're married, and so they're washing the dishes or something like that, and the guy says something, and the woman says, "See, you're in your white boy moment, and you're mansplaining, and this is the crap that I have to put up with at work." And she plays out this whole scenario of how her experiences are invalidated by people looking at her here. The whole thing is trivialized, because there can really be authentic ways in which people are subjected to racism on the job, and there are assholes out there in the world. They're real racists. But the whole thing is so trivialized that she takes the fact that people are looking at her braids as a demeaning experience. And it's meant to sort of like say to the people in the workplace, most of them were actually white. So one of the ways that you discriminate against someone is by looking or paying attention to a black woman's hair. Right. Okay. So you're expected to be silent and you're expected to be harangued and lectured to by experts in re-socializing and rehabilitating sessions. And so this is an issue, I think, of self-esteem. There is no logic and no reasoning to read such persons who have renounced reason and logic as adjudicating truth claims. I think here one has to just adduce oneself as evidence of the fact that one is probably just not a racist, and one is not a supplicant, and that you're interested in a dialogical experience, and that you reject the premise on which the conversation is taking place. That is an indictment of who you are based on immutable characteristics that you possess, which have no moral salience at all as to who you are as a person. Now, you put yourself out on a limb when you do that, because most people, I think, are herd followers, and they just go along with these diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And just brief, and the last one I want to deal with is reparations, because my last book that I wrote in 2021 deals what do white Americans owe black people, racial justice in the age of post-oppression, deals exclusively with this. So I don't have to consult notes for this one. Not that I have to consult notes for that. I just wanted it to be very specific. But basically, I argue that reparations are not owed to blacks for various reasons. One is reparations is defined as, among other things, the restitution in monetary terms or kind to a people who have been unlawfully deprived of property or rights that lead to irreparable damage. So I would say that reparations are due to certain blacks in the South, especially in Mississippi and the Deep South, where there are records on the books where whites did deprive blacks of their property and deprive them of passing on what one would call generational wealth. And in those cases where you can ostensibly point to, go back to the court records and show that property was denied, reparations are owed to such families. And I think in a handful of cases in Mississippi, reparations are being doled out to those individuals. But the idea of just doling out reparations to all blacks because their ancestors were slaves is problematic on many fronts. But what I argue is that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a momentous moment, but I call it the third founding of America. And that the passage of that act, which brought blacks not just fully into the domain of the ethical and granted them full equality before the law, but it did something also quite differently. It also, and I argue in the book that I think this is appropriate, it was a violation of the property rights of whites in the sense that it told, and it was a moral eugenical moment in this country, in that it told whites that you cannot use your property as an extension of your living room, that your businesses are now going to be treated as public utilities. And it attempted to re-socialize the sensibilities of white people and said, look, you can't be racist, which is a violation also of freedom of conscience. So I happen to think that the collusion between the state and whites in the past was so heinous in producing racist other white people that although it was an appropriation, it was a violation of property rights, given the evil of slavery and given the collusion between what I call the affirmative action program that existed for whites before the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that it was a right that had to be executed to undo a wrong that had been inflicted on blacks, but that there ought to be an expiration date on it. So when you look at the 1964 Civil Rights Act and its concomitant amendments, and you look at the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and you look at the 1972 Employment Act, and you look at all the affirmative action programs, I argue that short of a bloated totalitarian state, there's not that much more that a state can do to offer reparations. And when you look at the black study, when you look at what I call the revolutionary or the victim studies programs that emerged in the 1960s, starting with black studies, which gave rise to women's studies, gender studies, gay studies, Chicano studies, post-colonial studies, all kinds of studies that were advocacy studies and that granted those groups sort of made them sovereign masses on sovereign entities on universities, that the reparative gestures, if you codify them, they look something like reparations. And especially if you see the 1964 Civil Rights Act as what I call a eugenical moment. It really was to sort of take somebody's private property and to say, you can't use your property in the way that your conscience dictates, and your conscience is protected constitutionally. You can't use your property as an extension of your living room. You can't say, I don't want X person sitting at my lunch counter. Is a eugenical moment because it's an attempt to re-socialize and to tell a person that you can't carve out a conception of the good life for yourself in a way that's racist. So I defend the state's right. I defend the state in my book. I defend the state's eugenical overreach, given the evil nature of slavery and given the state's heavy-handed permittance of slavery. But I argue that affirmative action should have had an expiration date fixed onto it. I'm not calling for the repeal of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's law, and it's a good law because it granted blacks full equality before the law. But I don't argue in that book. I do not argue against reparations from a practical standpoint, like how would one, in an expedient manner, allocate funds, like who would get taxed and and so on and so forth. I argue against it from a moral perspective that is, and then I'll stop here and we can just talk about general things, but I argue from the position of morality that is, there are no persons living today who own slaves. The majority of whites living today, and we can prove this statistically, it has been proven, the majority of whites today, their ancestors came actually after the Civil War, right? So they actually, most of the whites living today, their ancestors did not own slaves. And if it's on the basis of enjoying white privilege, well, we all, to some extent, enjoy privileges. I mean, I have 5 college degrees, 2 as an associate, 2 undergraduates, a master's, and a PhD. So I enjoy something called educational privilege. I really don't know what I'm supposed to do with that educational privilege. Am I supposed to sort of talk down and sound stupid? I mean, so a privilege is like a blessing. It's like, short of exhorting whites not to use their privilege to eviscerate other people of their dignity, what are people supposed to do with their privilege? I mean, I like to tell this story when I was living in Atlanta, when I had first emigrated to this country. And I was lining up, this is the old days in the 80s, in the late 80s, where you went to the lube shop to get your oil changed and your car tuned up. And there was like 15 of us in the line, all of us men, and we're waiting in the hot sun. It was like 87 degrees. And this woman is in Atlanta. She had big blonde hair. She looked like she was from Texas, actually, because the hair was too big for Georgia. And she had like false eyelashes going up and down like Venetian blinds, and a mini skirt and stilettos that could hurt the pavement. I'm sure the pavement was squealing as she stomped. And she looked at us and she goes like, "Suckers," and she walked right to the front of the line. And all of us recognized that this was just like beauty privilege. Like none of us men stood a chance. And the 2 guys who were like manning the station, they were like, their mouths just fell open. They were drooling. They were like, and she said, "I need my car service right now, right now." And we just like what are you gonna do, right? So she had beauty privilege. She didn't join the line. She used her privilege. So when this whole thing about reparations is because people have certain privileges that they didn't earn, and that reparations is going to be based on a privilege. I think something, and I would love to hear what you guys think about this. It's undeniable that something like white privilege does exist for some white people, but I know that I have taught students, 90% of whom were in the Ku Klux Klan when I taught at Southern Illinois University. I found this out because I was getting gas in Vandalia, which my students told me was called Clandalia. This was right before I came to DePaul. Came to DePaul in 2000, it was 1998. Then I went to Cornell after that, and then came to DePaul. And one of my students said, "Dr. Hill, you can't do that because that's Clandalia. And by the way, 90% of your students are in the Klan." It so happened that most of those students were living in trailer parks. Some of them had teeth that were missing. They were poor as hell. They were in a bad situation. And they had been sort of acting up, and I just sort of thought, oh, these are just obstreperous children in my class. And I was a lot younger at the time. I'm in my 50s now. I was like 33, I think. And I looked younger than 33, so I thought they just are testing me. And I just got a judge's gavel, and I just banged it down, and I said, "Look, I just read them the riot act," and I said, "I don't care if you've never had a black instructor before, and I know most of you are in the Klan." And I just read them the act, and it was like a to serve with love moment. I was teaching a class in mathematical logic, and at the end of that year, I had them in my office every Sunday. I gave them free tutorials, and when I think about white privilege and I think about myself, I said to them, if any of you ever disrespect me, your grandfathers and your father can bring the guns on. I grew up in Jamaica, which is one of the most violent countries in the world. I've lived through extremely violent states of emergency. I've seen my best friend's girlfriend get raped on the beach. I've witnessed things that would make your parents do what they do, look like kindergarten play. So I say all of this to say that, I had certain cultural, financial capital that could defeat at any given moment any sort of privilege that any of them might have. I suppose there are certain ways in which they could exercise their white privilege, but it's a very complicated affair. I don't know that someone living in Appalachia is more privileged than President Obama's daughters. I'm just not sure. So to use the term white privilege unilaterally in the way that the reparationists, I call them, would like to use it in this sort of unilateral way to justify reparations is very, very problematic. So I think pointing out, I'm not sure that will be successful, but I think pointing out that there have been reparative moments in American history, going back to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, in which the property rights of blacks were, I would say properly, in a contextual, limited sense, violated, and a law was established that made it, that illegalized racism. Racism is now illegal in practice. That if one is committed to freedom, that's as far as a free society can go in transgressing the rights of others before we become a totalitarian state. That's the first point. And then the second point is it's predicated on a notion. If it's predicated on ancestral guilt, then that in and of itself is an evil ideal, because one could easily point to a lot of harms that groups have caused today, that if you were to reverse the switch and say, look, you have to pay for the crimes that your members of your group are inflicting on society today, we would call that quite nefarious. And the second is, if it's a form of ancestral guilt, then statistically, the majority of whites living today, their ancestors came during or after the Civil War, not before. So they didn't own slaves. And then just complicate the whole thing of white privilege, that one, collective guilt is a form of collectivism, and that one adduces oneself as evidence of simply being a non-racist, that one has not done anything to harm. So one has to go the road of individualism. One has not done anything to harm, to use one's agency to harm people of color. So why should one be penalized in that enterprise at all? So I'll just sort of stop there.